Aye. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Ms. Harris. No. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. No. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Jones. No. Mr. Kane. No. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Lankford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. No. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mrs. Loeffler. Aye. Mr. Manchin. No. Mr. Markey. No. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Ms. McSally. Aye. Mr. Menendez. No. Mr. Merkley. No. Mr. Moran. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Murphy. No. Mrs. Murray. No. Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Perdue. Aye. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Reed. No. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Romney. Aye. Ms. Rosen. No. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Schatz. No. Mr. Schumer. No. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. No. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Ms. Sinema. No. Ms. Smith. No. Ms. Stabenow. No. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Tester. No. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Tillis. Aye. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Udall. No. Mr. Van Hollen. No. Mr. Warner. No. Ms. Warren. No. Mr. Whitehouse. No. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Wyden. No. Mr. Young. Aye.
Is there any senator in the chamber wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If no, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. Right now. The question occurs on the adoption of Senate Resolution 488. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Booker? Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Bozeman? Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Braun? Mr. Braun? Aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? No. Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? No. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? No. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? No. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto? Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Mr. Cotton? Mr. Cotton? Aye. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Daines? Mr. Daines? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi? Aye. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Ms. Harris? Ms. Harris? No. Ms. Hassan? Ms. Hassan? No. Mr. Hawley? Mr. Hawley? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich? No. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones? No. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy? Aye. Mr. King? Mr. King? No. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? Aye. Mrs. Loeffler? Mrs. Loeffler? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin? No. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey? No. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? No. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? No. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Perdue? Mr. Perdue? Aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Roberts?
Order.
Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida? Aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith? No. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Warren? No. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye.
Is there any member in the chamber who wishes to vote or change his or her vote? If no, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The resolution is agreed to. Mr. Majority Leader?
Mr. Chief Justice, I ask unanimous consent that the Secretary be authorized to include statements of senators explaining their votes, either given or submitted during the legislative sessions of the Senate on Monday, February 3rd, Tuesday, February 4th, and Wednesday, February 5th, along with the full record of the Senate's proceedings and the filings by the parties in a Senate document printed under the supervision of the Secretary of the Senate that will complete the documentation of the Senate's handling of these impeachment proceedings.
Without objection, so ordered.
Further, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate resumes legislative session on Monday, February 3rd, Tuesday, February 4th, and Wednesday, February 5th, the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each for debate only.
Without objection, so ordered.
And finally, I ask unanimous consent that the trial adjourn until 11 a.m. February 3rd, and that this order also constitute the adjournment of the Senate.
Without objection, so ordered. We are adjourned.